I knew trans people, but I'm not sure that the trans movement was quite as much in the consciousness of the American public as it is now. And I don't think that I could necessarily get away with such a controversial character.
There's something electric about writers who don't just tell stories, but invite us into worlds where identity, desire, and imagination collide with blunt honesty. J.W. Steed is one of those writers. A seasoned novelist and essayist based around New York City, he's been weaving queer narratives long before it was popular, melding eroticism with speculative fiction in ways that are frank, funny, and deeply human. What struck me most with J.W.'s work isn't just the unabashed sexuality, though that's a big part of it. It's how he layers his stories with emotional truth and complexity. Like in his story Journey's End, where cloning becomes a poignant metaphor for love, loss, and the search for selfhood, all set against a background of sci-fi dystopia. It's sexy, yes, but also a meditation on family bonds and identity. He told me about writing queer characters who don't just exist on the sidelines, but live full, messy, joyful lives, with flaws, humor, and erotic freedom. And about pushing back against a publishing world that often asks queer erotic writers to play small or hide in closets, even today. What I love is how rooted his writing is in his own history, from youthful poetry inspired by Edward Lear to the candid personal essays on his long-running blog, exploring queer desire with wit and tenderness, and how his creative process reveals the roller coaster of a queer artist's journey, from moments of doubt, loss, and rejection to breakthroughs fueled by truth and vulnerability. If you've ever wondered how queerness and genre fiction can collide in bold new ways, or how eroticism can be a powerful tool for storytelling rather than just titillation, this conversation with J.W. Steed is a masterclass in that alchemy. So hold on tight as we dive into the erotic, the speculative, and the deeply personal, with a writer who reminds us that desire itself is a radical act of self-expression. This is Art in the Raw. All right, J.W. Steed, welcome to Art in the Raw. Thanks for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me, David.
I'm looking forward to the conversation. What first drew you to writing, and how did your queer identity shape that early creative voice that you had?
Very good question. I have always been a writer since I was a child, essentially. I began writing a lot of poetry, not any of it good by any means. But by the third or the fourth grade, I was writing a lot of poetry, a lot of comic poems. I was very influenced by the poetry of Edward Lear, the Victorian poet. He's the author of, I think his most famous poem would be The Owl and the Pussycat. Still a popular poem among kids these days, maybe. And I would write imitation poetry in his style and then tried to, branch out and write my own poetry as well. My teachers noticed that and started to suggest that I attend creative writing workshops that the public school that I was in was offering. So I would attend a lot of those. And throughout my elementary, middle, and high school years, I attended a lot of creative writing workshops, as long as they were free, because my parents didn't have the money to pay for it. So I always knew I wanted to be a writer. My career has gone a roller coaster kind of route to get to where I am. But in my 20s, I tried to send in novels that I was writing and to get them published. I had some success with short stories, which I had published in national magazines and Sunday newspaper supplements, that sort of thing. But I did not become a published novelist until I was in my 40s, when I realized that I had to buckle down and actually get things done. I started writing for a young adult imprint for teens and got my first books published that way. I branched out into adult books as well. Within the first 5 or 6 years that I started to get serious, I had 16 novels published internationally.
Nice.
I have had some that were even translated into foreign languages. And then later on, I've kind of branched out into this erotic side of my career, which has been very exciting and fun for me. So that's been my basic journey.
Can you recall a moment or experience that kind of made you realize that you wanted to write about that erotic queer desire?
I have always wanted to be very frank about my sexuality in my books, but I have not been able to do that just because of some of the genres that I was writing. When I was writing for young adults, you could be flirty a little bit,
Mm-hmm.
but you could not be outright sexual. The imprint that I was writing for was targeted primarily towards teenage girls. So the publishing house asked me if I would mind publishing under a female pseudonym, which I didn't mind at all. I don't really have much ego attached to putting my name to my real life name to a piece of fiction. When I was writing for adults, the primary market that I was writing for was adult women, women's literature, romance, that sort of thing. And I could not be very frank about my sexuality then either. Still, I was able to write about some aspects of my sexuality, even within those works. I was able to include in my very first novel, which I'm very proud about because it was the early 2000s, I had a trans character that really did not go very much remarked about. Nobody objected to it. I don't know if people noticed, perhaps not, but I thought that was fun to do. And I had queer characters of all kinds within subsequent novels. Even when I was writing under my own name, I was able to, for a fantasy series that I was doing, I was able to include a character who was the child of two gay adult parents. And that was quite satisfying to do. But being able to write frankly about my sexuality and to include, some of my own experiences and past sensory data has been very satisfying to me.
How long ago was the trans character that you mentioned in terms of how the politics is today around trans rights? How far ago was that?
This would have been in 2005, I want to say 2004, 2005. I knew trans people and,
Mm-hmm.
I was accepted them as what they were, but I'm not sure that the trans movement was quite as much in the consciousness of the American public as it is now. And
Agreed.
I don't think that I could necessarily get away with such a controversial character. It's not controversial to me or you, perhaps, but to many
To the
people,
general public, yeah.
and certainly to publishers these days. I don't think I could get away with that these days, unfortunately.
Yeah. You mentioned a few of your earlier literary influences, the poetry and such. How have those influences evolved as your work has developed?
Some of my earliest influences were very serious or very comic. I think that as a result that I've kind of mingled the two sometimes.
Uh-huh.
When my mom first took me to the adult side of the library, which was a big rite of passage to me, she took me to the adult side when I was, I think, 10 years old, about because I'd run out of books to read on the children's side. She gave me a handful of books, and among them was Shirley Jackson's We Have Always Lived in the Castle. And Shirley Jackson is the author of many respected short stories, novels. She's the author of the short story that just about everybody used to read in high school, The Lottery, which is
Mm-hmm.
quite famous. She's the author of The Haunting of Hill House, which was adapted into that Netflix series a few years ago. But also in that same library trip, she gave me the novel by Patrick Dennis, Auntie Mame, which of course has been made into movies and musicals since then. It's a ridiculous comic book. And those two authors have been among my favorites my entire life. I kind of tend to include, even in the most serious of my books, have comic scenes or comic little interludes, just because I believe it makes the serious parts more serious and the sexy parts more sexy.
That's a good way to
So
put it.
I read a lot. I've been able to adapt my own style from
Mm-hmm.
the authors that I have read, and I'm always happy to talk about the books that I love to read as well.
How has your involvement with the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers Association played in your artistic journey, especially with your more queer-focused content?
When I started to become serious about writing novels, my first novels were all fantasy novels. I wrote several. I wrote one, and I decided to find an agent with it. I sent it off to her, and as soon as she said, "Yeah, I kind of like this. Let me see if I can find a buyer for it," I started to write another. And then when I finished that one, I started to write another because the process of finding a publisher is quite exhausting and can be very long. The first book that you write may not be the first book that you publish. I
Mm-hmm.
teach writing as well, and I'm always hammering that point home to the writers in my workshops. Once you write a book, you have to keep on writing more because that first book might not be the one that hits. So I've always been interested in writing fantasies because they were what I loved to read as a child. I loved reading,
Same.
the Chronicles of Narnia. I loved reading the Lord of the Rings, those
Yep.
books, and I read those all throughout my youth. The Oz books were easily my favorites when I was a kid, and I remember the excitement of reading those, when I was a child and late at night under the covers with a flashlight, and that was just
Yep.
very exciting to me. And I wanted to, give that excitement back to readers. So, in the back of my mind, I've always wanted to write fantasy. I went, as I said, through that roller coaster route to get published, so I wasn't having my fantasies published at all for many years.
Mm-hmm.
But eventually, one of those first fantasies that I wrote did get published, and I was able to, parlay that into a membership in the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers. And I've been a member ever since, and proud to be one because they're a good organization. Lately, my last erotic novella has been a science fiction one, and that's the first actual science fiction that I've ever written. I've always been interested in the fantasy, but I enjoyed it so much that when my publisher earlier this week said, "Hey, would you like to write another science fiction book?" I was like, "Yeah, let's do that." I had so much fun with the last one. It's an exciting, science fiction and fantasy is exciting for me to read, and it's also fun to write.
It's interesting you mentioned some of those older fantasy novels that I also read, and I tend to judge a book that I read today based off of how closely it makes me recall how those books made me feel, the excitement and the fantasy.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So speaking of which, same-sex gay SF clone erotica kind of merges science fiction with explicit queer erotica. What inspired you and Frank Slater to tackle that theme of cloning, identity, and desire in that book?
To be blunt with you, it was sheer coincidence.
Mm-hmm.
Our publisher, Peter Schutz Publishing, asked us both to write science fiction stories. And Peter Schutz Publishing, I should say, is a line, it's an imprint that aspires to present pulp style, gay, queer erotica in traditional paperback format, so that the books look like the pulp paperbacks of old. And each paperback tends to have a theme. All of them are erotic themes. You can go to the website, which is peterschutz.com. That's SCHUTES.
Put it in the show notes for those listening.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can look at the lines there. But he wanted to branch out and try a science fiction story. And he knew that I was an SFWA member, so he asked me to submit one. And Frank Slater and I both submitted, by pure coincidence, stories that happened to be about clones. So he decided to put them together and turn them into a duology,
Nice.
both about clone stories. It was nice, and I think that they fit well together. And it's interesting to see what somebody else does with the same sort of theme.
Yeah, definitely. Especially when you don't even know that the other person's doing it, then you can immediately compare notes.
Exactly.
Can you walk us through the creative process that you had for stories like Journey's End or Billy Club?
Yeah, Journey's End is my story in the duology called Same Sex. I've actually got a copy right here. And it's a story about a scientist who is preparing a frontier planet for colonization. And while he's watching a video transmission, essentially a Zoom call, from a scientific orbital post that's above the planet, he happens to discover that his ex-boyfriend is screwing around with his clone. And what follows after that is a story of sexual obsession, of coming to terms with having lost somebody, and how we make amends to the people that we love even after they have moved on. I did not have all that in mind when I started this story. I just wanted to write a sexy story.
It's kind of evolved.
Yeah, exactly. one of the things I did when I was thinking about the story was to say, okay, maybe I want to do clones. And I thought, well, I don't want to necessarily have the clones have sex with each other, but I want them to blend together in ways that the reader might not be able to distinguish between them, and the clones themselves might not be able to distinguish between the other. And I think that happens to a certain extent in my story. A lot of the story arose from what I was actually going through at the time. My dad had been, essentially his health had been failing for a very long time before I was writing the story. But I'd gotten halfway through the story and was enjoying writing it quite a bit when I got a call that I better get to the hospital because it was going to be his last day, essentially. So I went to the hospital and spent the day with him. It was very sad and very depressing. Got home and I woke up the next morning and my husband kind of had found out during the night that my dad had passed away, but he let me sleep because he knew how exhausted I was. And he told me that morning. And, it was very affecting, of course. But I didn't really have anything else to do that day except for sit around and feel sad. So I channeled a lot of that energy into finishing the story. So the last half of the story came out in a way that I didn't entirely expect based on the circumstances at the time. I kind of turned the story into a meditation on how we might hew close to our progenitors, the people who have sired us, whether in this case it was clones. In my case, I was thinking about my father, and how even though we hew close to them, we still differ in vitally essential ways. And exploring those differences is what made the story interesting to me. So
Agreed.
the rest of the day, I just sat down, wrote a scene in which the protagonist makes amends with his ex-boyfriend, the one who's cheating with his clone, in which they confront each other and share a sexy scene because it is erotica after all. And then I wrote a ending that still leaves me in tears whenever I read it, just because I think of the emotion that I was feeling that day. But that last half of the story just became really emotion-packed for me, and I hope it does for readers as well, because of what I was going through.
Yeah. I could definitely feel, as I was reading through it, the emotion that you're talking about.
Well, thank you. I'm glad you could.
The book's introduction discusses kind of the lack of queer representation in science fiction. How did that gap influence your approach to writing that collection?
I think that there is a certain degree of queer representation in science fiction. Even in the 1980s, I can remember reading science fiction novels that had queer characters in them.
Mm-hmm.
I do not think that there is a lot of very sexual queer characters. When queer characters are allowed to exist, they are often very sexless. They don't have any physical contact with other queer characters. I think of a novel like Ethan of Athos, which is a Lois McMaster Bujold novel, one of her earliest ones, which is set in space and it basically has a planet of the queers, where the entire planet is men, and they reproduce using petri dishes and that sort of thing. And they're fairly explicitly gay coded and have relationships with each other, but they don't actually have sex at any point. And when I read that, I was kind of disappointed. And I'm not expecting to find these sort of outright sexually explicit scenes that I pen in my novels, but some types of let them have some fun, essentially, is what I would like to see.
Yeah.
So I kind of in my novels like to take a literary approach. I like them to be well written, and I like my novels to have engaging characters and be thoughtful and be funny at the same time. But I like them to be sexy as well. My characters should have fun. They deserve it.
Yeah. And I recognized that as I was watching some of the latest episodes of some of the Star Trek series where they have some openly gay characters, some openly non-binary characters, and some of the other sci-fi. Bortus is one character from one of the sci-fi series that I'm not recalling the name of it at the moment, but he was in a same-sex relationship and they even had a child together, but you didn't see overt sexual intimacy between the characters. It was just hinted at.
I agree. And in Star Trek Discovery, which I think is the one you're talking about, you've got male characters who are essentially husbands and definitely partners and lovers, but they at most they share a chaste kiss. Now this is
Yeah.
partly because of the franchise,
Yeah.
but they could deserve some shirtless, sexy time in bed with the
Agreed.
covers pulled up.
If Captain Kirk can have some shirtless, sexy time, I don't see why
Exactly.
the other two couldn't.
Exactly.
So you've also got a blog that you write. It's not erotic fiction, it's erotic personal essays.
Yes, it is.
How does that interplay between the fiction that you write and your autobiography?
Another good question. I have been keeping a blog online for 15 years now. It's been since 2010. So that's a big chunk of my life, in which I write about my erotic history, in which I write about my erotic adventures, in which I think about and discuss sexuality. Again, as I said, it's not fiction. It's all me, essentially. I had a storied youth, so I have a lot of stories from my teenage years and 20s in which I discuss the things that I did then as a sexual being. And it's gone on for 15 years now, with varying degrees of enthusiasm on my part. There haven't been any huge years-long lapses, but sometimes there may be several months that go by between entries, depending on what other projects I'm doing at the time and how much fun I happen to be having. But I discuss all kinds of things in my blog. I use my past a lot in my erotic writing because
Mhm.
writing that blog is how I became comfortable with writing sexual scenes. When I was writing romances or women's fiction under a woman's pen name, I couldn't write, well, for one thing, I was writing straight love scenes, for which I have limited enthusiasm, shall we say. And for another, I couldn't get as explicit as I necessarily do in my current erotic fiction or on my blog. So I wasn't entirely comfortable with writing explicit scenes at first. And as a challenge, I decided to keep this blog so that I could develop that side of myself.
Mhm.
And it has, boy, has it developed. That's all I'm going to say. But I use a lot of my blog material for my fiction. The first erotic novella I ever had published, for example, was called Sleazy A, which is part of the anthology Dirty Dorms and Fresh Men. You can kind of guess the theme from that.
Infer.
And yes, exactly. And it's a look into a single weekend of a character named Wick, who's a sophomore at a small southern college. And he has encounters with three different gentlemen who represent three kind of archetypes of queer men at the time. And it's set in the 1980s. But one of them is a favorite married professor of his. Another one is an overnighter with a closeted professor who's so far back into the closet that it makes him toxic to be around. And finally, there's a chance at romance with a younger man his own age. This book is fictional in the sense that the main character has a different name for myself. Essentially, it is three encounters with three different men that I knew during my college years.
Mhm.
And the first two men are encounters straight out of my history. The third one is a fictionalized version of a boy that I had a chance with, but to whom I said no, unfortunately. And we spent the rest of the year after I said no regarding each other mournfully from across the classroom. You can hear the violins playing in the background as I tell you this.
I hear the
And he
longing
moved
in your
to
voice.
there was longing in our eyes too. He moved to New York City shortly after graduation and died in that first wave of the AIDS pandemic. And for the rest of my life, I have regretted not getting to know him better. So this first novel is a way of memorializing him in fiction and giving him a life beyond the life that he actually had.
It's beautiful.
Well, thank you. I regret, not saying yes to him at the time, and it came out in this story. But this is a way for me to celebrate my past and to translate my sexual fun into fun for others.
So the stories that you write in your most recent book and some of your other writings are definitely, as you mentioned, unapologetically kind of explicit. How do you see the role of eroticism playing in advancing the narrative and deepening character development?
We are all, well, not all of us, but most of us are very sexual creatures. Most of us also have a certain degree of reticence about expressing that. I think that as an artist, however, pornography is a wonderful thing to create. And, whether you call it erotica or whether you call it pornography, I use them interchangeably. They're both fun to create, fun to consume. When you write erotica, when you create pornography, you are setting the example that you want to see in the world. Sometimes these characters can be cautionary. For example, when I wrote about that professor who was so far in the closet that he was toxic to everyone around him, that was a real life person, but I learned from him about what I did not want to be as a sexual gay adult. And, I want to communicate that to others as well, that, living your life, enjoying your sexuality can make you a better person, I think. When you're writing erotica, you're celebrating an important part of yourself, or at least I hope that you think it's an important part of yourself. And this goes for any artist, whether they're writers or not. But you're celebrating a part of yourself in a way that arouses not only these sexual organs, even though that can be a valid end goal, but you're also trying to arouse a person's hopes and fear. You're trying to arouse their laughter as well. And, maybe you're even trying to draw a tear from them. Erotica does not limit itself to, the down below organs. It is a buffet of the senses, and it should be arousing all kinds of senses and emotions. You're being provocative in the best way when you are writing or creating erotic works. Mm-hmm. You are pleasing readers, you're pleasing viewers, whatever medium you work in. And on one side, and on the other side, you're pissing off all the right people, the people who wish to suppress it. And when you're creating something pornographic or something erotic, you're sharing of yourself. You're making yourself vulnerable. And I think the best art comes from that place of vulnerability. I think being able to, I think when you're able to open yourself up in that way, when you're able to communicate something that you feel about so strongly, as I feel about the enjoyment of one's sexuality, you're writing from a place of strength.
Yep. Yeah, that's a beautiful way to put it. Want to strip down and connect with a community that celebrates real bodies, real stories, and unforgettable adventures? Check out Go Naked Magazine, a bold, body-positive magazine for gay male nudists. And if you're ready to turn the page and travel, Go Naked Travel curates incredible clothing-optional getaways around the world. Think sun, skin, and seriously good vibes. Subscribe today at gonakedmagazine.com and gonakedtravels.com. Hey, queers. If this conversation moves you, don't just listen. Help us keep this platform alive so we can keep amplifying queer voices in art. Salon Naturel and Art in the Raw shine a spotlight on queer artists because their truth leads the way. Follow us on social, subscribe to our newsletter, or join our Patreon for exclusive content. Every follow, share, and membership keeps queer art visible and vibrant. Links are in the show notes. Thank you for standing with us and for keeping our community bold, creative, and unfiltered. Stay raw, y'all. So on the topic of cloning again, if we could go back to that one in your new book, Same Sex, there's a strong undercurrent of social commentary on clone rights and commodification of bodies. How do you think these elements mirror contemporary issues for queer communities?
I'm very glad you picked up on that. I'm not sure anybody else has commented on that to me about, but when I was writing the book, I was thinking about what rights do these clones have and how much freedom do they have? And I almost wanted to write an entire another book set in this universe in which I explored that. But I was trying to keep, within a certain word count and trying to keep it sexy. So I didn't get to explore that. But it certainly was on my mind the entire time. In this universe of Journey's End, which is my story in the clone duology, the protagonist creates 32 clones of himself because the universe in which he exists has just suffered an enormous pandemic of its own. And those of his scientific team who are supposed to colonize and prepare this planet for colonization, I should say, have either gone back to their own homes or have passed away in the pandemic. And he has no scientific team left. And he says, well, if there were 32 of me to get the job done, we could do this. So he gets 32 clones of himself made. They have varying degrees of similarity to him. They all look like him. They all have the physical imprint, because I pictured the clone machine, or whatever you want to call it, as kind of a 3D printer using biological materials. So they all look like him. But there are certain classes of the clones. There's the class C clone, I think, which has 25% of his memory, a class B clone that has 50% of his memory, and then there's a very special, very expensive S-class clone that has 98% of his memory. That happens to be the one that his ex-boyfriend is fooling around with. The class C clones do not have I can't say this word,
Citizenship.
Right. That's the one it writes in his universe. The Class B ones will eventually have citizenship, but do not currently. The protagonist shares with his S-class clone all the rights of a citizen. And while I was writing that, I was thinking, how is this company exploiting the workers? Do they consider themselves exploited? What are they going to do after this planet is prepared? And how are they going to disperse and find identities of their own outside of the original progenitor? It's a lot of questions. I don't have any explicit answers for you, but it is interesting for me to think about. As I said, I've agreed to write another science fiction story, and I'm going to set it in the same universe. It's not going to be about clones, but perhaps I will try to address this idea of citizenship and how it is earned in this kind of dystopian universe. One of the aspects of Journey's End is that it is really a dystopian civilization. The only way that the scientific project is going to get done is because they have a sponsorship deal with a fast food company. And, I can see that happening within our own society within a couple of decades, where, this was written before the last Trump administration, but where scientific research is derided and unfunded, and it has to be done through corporations that really have no vested interest in the science itself.
Yep. What is the response from readers in the queer literary community have any of the reactions surprised you?
I have not had many other authors reach out to me explicitly about my erotic materials. Writer friends of mine who read me enjoy it, which is always a nice thing. And I have some positive feedback going on with other writers with whom I share works and with whom I get advice and that sort of thing. But the queer literary
community, as it might be,
they haven't reached out to me en masse yet. I welcome their feedback.
Well, maybe they will after we release this episode.
Hopefully.
That would be nice. So let's talk a little bit about kind of challenges and risks. What's been the most challenging aspect of writing and publishing queer erotic fiction, especially within the science fiction genre?
I'm aware that writing erotica is always a risk because, as I said, it does piss off all the best people.
Mm-hmm.
I have not had a lot of blowback, though. The people who reach out to me are the ones who actually enjoy reading. And with so much material out there for people to consume, people are able to pick and choose what they want to read, what they want to watch, what they want to listen to. And I am always surprised when people decide to pile on to somebody to whom they aren't interested anyway. So I haven't had any blowback exactly. But there are always risks. People do look down upon you when you write in certain genres. But I have always had that kind of blowback, no matter what the genre I've written in. When I was writing for young adults, I had quite a lot of people saying, "You're only a young adult writer. Why should you have an opinion on anything?" When I wrote for women, that was especially telling because people would say, these are just books for chicks. Why should we read them? Why should we listen to you as an author? When you write for certain genres, whether it's fantasy or science fiction, people are going to look down on you. I always find that if someone is going to attempt to dump their insecurities and on you, then they're going to find a way to do it no matter what you're doing. So it's always best to just go ahead, write what you feel, create the art that you want to create, and damn the consequences.
Do you think there's any increase in censorship or pushback for queer-themed erotica given today's political climate in the industry?
I think there is easily pushback. It's difficult for some queer erotic writers to publish some of the stories they want to be published because they often will be rejected from many venues. I know that Peter Schurz Publishing, my publisher, sometimes has issues with certain types of stories, or if Amazon or another book-selling venue is particularly anxious about a particular theme in a story, they will just completely not sell it. So there are always things that need to be worked around. I have not experienced any of that myself yet. Maybe I'm just not pushing hard enough.
You got to push the right buttons, apparently.
I'm not hitting the right buttons. I have to have more orgy scenes, more dad-son scenes. But so there's always risks, and there's always the possibility that some random person at the other end of a button is going to say, no, this story should not see the light of day, and therefore they won't distribute it. That's always going to be a risk.
Can you share a moment when you maybe doubted your creative path along the way, along the years, and what helped you move forward?
Writing is not the most fun thing to do for me. I always find the process of sitting down with my laptop and staring at the blank page to be very intimidating. And I teach, and so I always communicate this to my students, that the writing itself, the day-to-day act of sitting down, setting aside time, writing, looking at your piece and saying, oh God, this is terrible. That is not fun. But the totality of the act is one of the most joyous things that I have ever and could ever experience. So I recommend going into it with your eyes wide open, that not every day is going to be fun, but realizing that the process itself is worth it.
Was there a breakthrough or a turn? Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, keeping that in mind, looking at my career as a whole, there have been times when trying to get, especially in the beginning, trying to get works accepted, trying to find an agent or trying to find a publisher, those rejection notices can really hurt your feelings.
I can imagine.
It shouldn't, because when you're on the hunt for an agent, you're really looking for somebody who's going to be enthusiastic about you, who's going to want to represent you, and who's finds your work exciting. So if you get, as a writer, if you're getting rejection notices that say this isn't for me, you honestly should be grateful. You should be grateful that this person is being upfront about what they want and letting you know that you're not it, so that you can find that person who is interested in you. I can say that now because I've found people who were interested in me. But in my early years, when I was trying to find those people, getting those rejection letters was quite dispiriting.
I can imagine.
And some of them were borderline, well, I want to say more than hostile. But I got one from a old established New York agent who's like, if I had a dime for every time somebody sent me a proposal of this crap, then I would be a billionaire and I wouldn't have to be representing you goddamn authors. I was like, oh, maybe this isn't my problem. Maybe it's a you problem at this point.
Exactly.
So those kind of rejections can really hurt.
Yeah.
And even when you are an established writer and you think you've got something, you're onto something, and you're trying to find somebody else enthusiastic about it, and nobody else seems to be showing that same enthusiasm, that can be dispiriting too. But overall, the process, I find, is meditative if you allow it to be, solitary if you're in a bad mood, but worth it.
How do you hope your work, and same-sex in particular, contributes to the broader conversation about queer representation in literature and art?
I would love to see more works, especially in science fiction, in which queer sexuality is celebrated, in which queer characters are accepted as a norm. They're not explained away or apologized for. I would love to see more works in which queer characters of all stripes, not just the gay men, but all of the queers, are celebrated and find their place within the universe. Fiction is such a flexible,
Absolutely.
open, wide open genre to write in. You can create worlds that have nothing to do with this one. And I just want to see people take their place within that universe.
The only limit is your imagination.
Absolutely. It's absolutely true.
Are there future projects you're working on that you're excited to explore?
Well, as I said, I just started a new science fiction project. Peter Shoots Publishing came to me and said, would you be willing to write another science fiction story? I was like, sure. And he said, well, it has to be about a road in outer space. That is really weird.
A road in outer space.
I don't know how to do that. And I said that to myself. I didn't say it to him. I was like, all right, let me think about that. And I went to bed that night, and there's that liminal area between sleep and wakefulness where you're just kind of lying there and your brain is going. And I was thinking, okay, I've got an image of two men on this alien road against a foreign horizon with groves of trees on either side. And then I was like, yeah, I could write this story. So I got very excited about it because I started thinking about what are these two men doing on that road? What is this alien ecology that's surrounding them? Who are the people that built this road so long ago in the past? And then I was off and running on another story. And it's exciting to start a story and have nothing but questions and nothing but ideas. Nothing's quite set in stone so that your imagination can still roam free. And I'm very excited to have been working on that for the last 2 or 3 days.
Nice. What advice would you give emerging queer writers who want to push boundaries in their own work and get published?
Be true to yourself. One of the things that I ask my own writers on my workshops to do is to think about a credo, things that they strongly believe in. I like them to write actual statements in which just, make a list of statements of stuff that you believe in. Things like, I believe my work should be heard. If you believe that strongly, that's what you need to do to be a writer or an artist. Write about, if you feel strongly about politics, make a series of statements about politics. If you feel strongly about the connections between yourself and your family, write statements because from those statements of belief is where strong writing emerges. If you don't believe in things strongly, you can tell it in your writing. If you do believe about what you're writing and you feel it in your heart and you feel it in your gut and maybe even you feel it in your groin if you're writing erotica, you're going to write something that's strong and relatable and other people want to read. So I say, know what you believe, feel strongly about what you believe, and be willing to communicate that to people in an honest way.
I think that's really great advice. And I think it also merges pretty well with something you mentioned earlier around how the best writing, the best art comes from a place of vulnerability. And sometimes when you're in that place of vulnerability, you've got to be able to be truthful with those statements that you were just talking about writing down with yourself and with your audience about what those statements are. I love that. Thank you for sharing that.
And I don't even believe you need to, those statements don't actually have to appear in your novel.
Yeah.
Or your short story or whatever. But you do have to be able to communicate your feelings about what you're trying to say.
Why you're doing it.
And why you're doing it.
All right. Well, it's time for the 10 questions that we ask at the end of every podcast interview. These 10 questions are inspired by Inside the Actor Studio, but we've put a little bit of an artistic flair to them. So are you ready?
I guess I'm as ready as I will be.
Number 10? What is your favorite artistic medium or tool?
I suppose it would be words. Words are what I work with. They're what I enjoy working with best. And they've always been my medium of choice.
Since you're a writer, what literary trend or cliche do you wish would disappear?
If you had asked me this at various times in my literary career, I could have answered so easily. There was a time that I was ready for vampire novels to disappear.
In the
There
90s?
wasn't exactly. There was a time I was ready for dystopian young adult novels to disappear. I'm not really sure what I would want to disappear right now, but I think it would be the novels by or the works of fiction by people who didn't actually write it but have big names. If I if a real housewife is supposed to have written a novel, I don't want to read it.
Yeah.
If somebody who is famous has written their memoir, but I can pick it up and tell that it isn't in their voice at all, I'm not going to enjoy it. So
Yeah.
that's the answer I'm going to go with.
What fuels your creativity the most?
What fuels my creativity the most would be partaking in media that I have not had a hand in. Watching television programs that excite me, watching movies that excite me, reading other books that excite me, going back to old favorites that inspired me in the past. Those are the things that I think keep me going.
What sound or noise instantly inspires you?
A sound or a noise that inspires me? What a curious question. I will tell you that when I write, I tend to write with headphones on, and I tend to have music playing very loudly. And usually it tends to be pop that I don't have to listen to very closely,
Mm-hmm.
but which I still enjoy. So I'm not going to give any particular noise or song, the most prominent
Music in general.
position here, but just music in general.
Yeah.
If you catch me writing, chances are I'm probably blasting Kylie Minogue in my ears.
I can appreciate that. What sound or noise completely kills your focus?
I can tell you that easily. The sound of my cats yakking up. That brings everything to an instant halt. When I'm writing, I'm also listening to see what the cats are up to because I'm usually at home. And either they are getting into a fight on the front porch with cats that are passing by, or they are yakking up, and I will have to hop to my feet and clean it up immediately. There you go.
What's your favorite word or phrase to include in your work?
One of my favorite words, I don't ever use it all that often because I don't want it to be noticed, is the word susurrus, it's kind of like a hush. It's kind of like the hush noise that tall grasses make in the wind. It's almost an onomatopoeia.
Yeah.
I love to sneak it in when I can. I don't do it very often because it's such an unusual word that I'm afraid it will be noticed.
Well, onomatopoeia is also an interesting word to throw in there every once in a while.
But I don't spell it that well.
If you could see any queer artist or writer, living or dead, honored with a major public monument, who would it be?
Public monument. I think I would go back to the author I mentioned before, Patrick Dennis, who was so important to me in my childhood. He was a queer author. He wrote during the 50s and 60s and very early 70s. And as I said, he's most famous for the novel Auntie Mame, but he wrote so many others, and they're such sharp satires of the things that he likes to skewer, which is showbiz and business and Westchester County, New York City, and New York City itself. And his aim is always true. His sharp wit never failed. I don't think that his works outside of Auntie Mame get any attention these days, and it's a shame because he's still a very funny writer.
I think if there was I was going to say, I think if there was a statue with him, I think at the bottom of it, it should say, "Life is a banquet," and so many poor souls are hungry. I think I'm probably going to get skewered for getting that quote wrong.
Isn't it starving to death?
Starving to death. There
something
you go.
Like that.
Yeah.
Live, that's the message. Live? Yes, life is a banquet, and most poor suckers are starving to death. Now, come on, Agnes, live. Come try it.
We'll get there in the end.
Yeah, don't hate me in the comments. What is one profession or creative field you could never see yourself in?
Well, I will tell you that I rejected a career as an academic. My parents were both academics. They taught history. And they kind of expected me to be an academic as well. And I followed in their footsteps for the longest time. I studied for a PhD. I used to teach. I used to I worked as a college professor for quite a long time, adjunct, not actually tenured or anything. But I rejected it because I did not want to live that monastic life that I saw my parents living, trying to publish and trying to not perish in the process. It was the life had a calling for me. It was very seductive. It could be very sweet for those people who enjoy it, but in the end, it really wasn't for me because I couldn't be true to myself, true to what I wanted to do. And I could not see myself as a queer man being an academic. I'm not saying that others can't.
If your art could take on a life of its own, what form would it take? Your art, if your literature could take on a life of its own, what form would it take?
This is a funny question because one of my novels, when I was writing women's fiction, almost became a reality TV show, which horrified me. I wrote a book in which it was about a man on the make and the methods that he used to try to pick up chicks. This was back in the days of, I can't remember the name of it, that handbook for men who would try to pick up women by dissing them and negging them or whatever it was called. But I wrote this fiction. It almost became a reality TV show. It was optioned. I actually got some money for it. Not a lot, but I got some money for it. And as an author, free money is always a fantastic thing. And I was just sitting back in horror thinking, what the hell are they going to do with this? And how are they going to turn it into a reality TV show? And when I saw it, the proposal for it, I was like, all right, go ahead. My name in small print, please. So I'm glad that did not happen in the end because the results would have been horrifying.
And then finally, 100 years from now, what do you hope your literature says about you to those who find it in the future?
I hope that somebody who finds it in the future will read it, say, wow, this guy knew what he was talking about even back then, and respond to it in the way that I intended. I don't particularly think much about legacy. It would be nice to be read after my demise. It would be nice to be remembered, but I focus very much on the here and now and trying to give the people who read me pleasure now rather than thinking about what people in 100 years will think of me. That said, if you are 100 years in the future and you happen to be watching a recording of this podcast, hey from the past, and I hope you're enjoying
the work. From the past. Well, JW, it was very nice talking to you and getting to know you. Looking forward to seeing what comes next with your byline on it.
Well, thank you. And I'm looking forward to hearing more from your podcast, which I enjoy very much.
Thank you. I appreciate that feedback too. Thanks for joining us in this raw conversation. If this artist's work resonates with you, you can find their social media links in the show notes below. And remember, art thrives when we lift each other up. Tag us at Salon Naturel or hashtag #ArtLaRaw with your reactions. We repost listener art every Friday. Unlock uncensored studio tours, erotic art zines, and voting power on future guests by joining our Substack or Patreon. Links below. If this episode sparks something in you, leave a 5-star review with the word RAW in the title. Algorithms hate us. Your voice keeps us visible. This episode was produced by Salon Naturel, with editing by David Smith. Original theme music by Exicat. And keep making art that terrifies the censors. This is David Smith. Until next time, stay raw, stay rebellious.